for those of us who are new, he is the regional leader for World Vision International for the South Asia Pacific region. And we are very glad that he is joined today to teach us the Word of God. And so today we'll be looking at the subject of learning from Isaac. Yeah, over to Brother Cherian. Thank you and welcome, Brother Cherian.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me be part of this time of study. And I just was, thinking about what it is that we can take and what it is that we can study, which will also be in some sense relevant to the times that we live in, and the attitudes that sometimes get reflected both externally as well as within the church as well. And so I really thought that one character whom we sometimes kind of gloss over, the fact is that when the Lord met up with Moses and during the call of Moses, when he was trying to say who he was, he said, "I'm the God of your father, the God of Abraham, of Isaac, and Jacob." And sometimes what happens is when we look at the way we talk about people, and then, when names are given, Abraham is well known, seen as the father of Israel, father of the nation, both the Muslims and the Jews, and in some sense the church also has that claim on Abraham. The minute it comes to Jacob, again, there is a very strong way in which, at least in terms of Jewish tradition, where Jacob is seen as the father of the 12 patriarchs, the 12 tribes of Israel. And both of them were, in that sense, very strong characters. Abraham, someone who listened and responded to the call of God and went out, in one sense, the father of faith, as he's called, and became the father of a nation. Jacob, someone who actually wrestled with God, and it said fought with God and won a wrestling match. Someone who was so dogged and determined, and very smart at getting his way. And somewhere sandwiched between these two very, very colorful personalities is the personality of Isaac, who's often missed out, and who's never often the subject of any form of even hero worship, or he's never really seen as, in that sense, a leader. But whenever God identifies himself, and Jesus himself brings us up, this whole idea of being seen the God of Abraham, of Isaac, and Jacob. So he's no less the God of Isaac than he is of Abraham and Jacob. And not just because Isaac was Abraham's son or Jacob's father, but you will find as we study his life that on his own terms, he was someone who could very clearly forge this relationship and connect with God, and because of which he clearly is named and numbered among the heroes of faith in the Bible. So that's why I thought this would be useful for us. And what I'll do is I'll just share my screen. We will have one primary passage that we will study, but I'll just take you gently just for us to have a quick overview. Suppose you can see my screen? Yeah. You can all see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Just wanted to be sure. Just a minute. Let me. Yeah. Okay. So I'm not going to go through each of these passages, but clearly what we know is that Isaac was a miracle child. Okay, so when Abraham was 99 years old, God had appeared to him and said that I will make a covenant between me and you and will greatly increase your numbers. And Abraham was a little amused. He says, "Will a son be born to me now? I'm 99 years old already. Will Sarah who is again not as old as I, but 9 years younger, at the age of 90, will she bear a child? And we find that the Lord restates that promise that Abraham would be a father, Sarah would be a mother. And then we find in chapter 18 of Genesis where he comes back and he says that, look, I will return to you about this time next year. And Sarah, your wife, will have a son. And we know that Sarah laughed. And that's when you have that comment where the Lord said to Abraham, why did Sarah laugh? Is anything too hard for the Lord? And that question that was asked. And clearly it was clear that this was not something that was too hard for God. Well and ripe into the time when Abraham was 100, Sarah was in her 90s, they actually were blessed with a son, Isaac. So that was clearly the fact that he was a miracle child. The second thing that we see as Isaac grew up, he was a victim of bullying. Okay, as many children are, you will find that older siblings, older friends, older relatives have a tendency to bully a younger one. And Isaac was no exception. And Ishmael, who was the son of Abraham through Sarah's servant lady, servant girl, servant maid, um, was probably a few years older than Isaac. And as often happens, Isaac became the favorite child. And so probably there was a little bit of sibling rivalry and jealousy. And that ultimately Isaac was Sarah's son. And so in one sense, seen as the true heir and someone who really had Abraham's lineage far more strongly than himself. And so probably all this was there. There was a little bit of that tension that sometimes happens. And so you find that uh, that Isaac was a victim of bullying. It says that he was mocked by his brother. And this irritated Sarah. And sometimes when parents get into fights where children have fights, where parents get into it, it is not necessarily a very pleasant thing. And we find a very unpleasant interlude where Hagar is kind of banished. And she and her son were sent out, and they are in the desert, they are struggling, their water is over, and the Lord comes and miraculously rescues them. And then you find Hagar in her own way, someone who actually named God. Okay, so that's what we see. But then clearly, what we see is that Isaac was a victim of bullying. Okay? Then we find another very interesting part of his life, where this was again at a time when sacrificing children was of their own offspring. Human sacrifice was often part of religious worship. And so that itself would not have been surprising. But the point is, it was surprising that God would have asked Abraham, the God of the Bible would have asked Abraham to do it. Nonetheless, Abraham took this very precious son, who was someone who was so, who was actually the hope of his for the future, who was the means by which God's covenant and God's promise would be fulfilled. And he says that, look, okay, he probably believed that if Isaac was killed, God could raise Isaac from the dead. And that's how it gets described later, when he is commended for his faith, that the same the same God to whom he was sacrificed would probably be able to raise him up from the dead. Okay, and that is again quite amazing. You find that in Hebrews chapter 11. By faith, Abraham, when God tested him, offered Isaac as a sacrifice. And Abraham reasoned that God could even raise the dead. And so, in a manner of speaking, did receive Isaac back from death. So Abraham is often someone who is commended for his journey of faith. But what about Isaac himself? How would Isaac have been? We don't know how old he was, but he was certainly old enough to communicate, to talk. He was fairly intelligent. He says, "Yeah, we have all the ingredients for the sacrifice, but where is a lamb?" So he probably was not that young. He certainly was sentient. There are some who believe he could have been a young teenager. He could certainly have run away if he knew that he would be the sacrifice. He may even have been stronger than Abraham himself, but we don't know. So perhaps when he saw this happen, he did. The Bible does not record anything about him dissenting or him disagreeing. He saw Abraham's faith, and I think he shared Abraham's faith. He says, if this is what God wants to do, then yes, I'm the willing sacrifice. So was he a willing sacrifice is a question that will continue to 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 get asked, and something that we can keep thinking about when we look at Isaac's life. But clearly, he was also, in one sense, an active participant in that process, which Abraham gets commended for. And then you find that he then becomes a happy husband and a father. We find how Abraham sends his servant, his steward, to find a wife for his son. And one of his cousins is whom he marries. So he did not get married from the place where they were. He went back and linked to his family. And we find that Isaac at that stage was 40 years old. He was not that young. And he and Rebecca, they loved each other. And he also loved her. It says that he loved her and he was comforted after his mother's death. So his ability to trust God was again something that probably came up when he saw the whole process of having probably held off from getting married to the people who were around, from the choosing from the clans around, people who did not worship God, to marrying someone from his own family, his own clan. And that was something that he did and he was willing to wait for. And then it says that his wife was not able to conceive. And it was when he was 60 that he actually became a father. So he prayed to the Lord on behalf of his wife because she was childless. And then you find both the twins are born, Esau and Jacob. Okay. So he was not a young father. He was a very, very mature father. He was already a senior citizen by today's standards when he became a father. Then you find that he also repeated his father's mistakes. Okay, I'm just taking you through a journey of his life as recorded in the book of Genesis. So there was a famine in the land, and he went down to where the land of the Philistines were in Gerar, it says, and he went to Abimelech, king of the Philistines. And there again, he did exactly what his father had done two times, once with the Pharaoh in Egypt and with Abimelech himself. Whether it was the same Abimelech or Abimelech's father and the son was also called the same name is not clear. But clearly he referred to his wife as his sister. And in one sense, she was a cousin sister. So to that extent, he was not entirely inaccurate. But clearly the fear of human beings in terms of more powerful adversaries, in terms of what they could do with him, is something that comes up. And he does exactly what his father did. But ultimately, his lie, he's found out in his lies, and the king is in some sense, he was irritated. He was not very happy about it. But clearly, at some point, he recognized who Isaac was and what he did, and he probably knew him from his father's time, and he was very clear that Isaac would not be harmed. And it says Isaac then became rich, and his wealth continued to grow until he became very, very wealthy. And he had so many flocks and herds and servants that the Philistines envied him. So it is at that point that we find in his life, he has reached a certain stage of comfort. He has had his own journey. His father was no more. He was living in one sense on his own. He was now the leader of his little clan. And he had grown in prosperity. So it is at this point in his life that he has a series of incidents, and that's what we will look at. So can I request any of you to just read what I have put up on the screen? So any one of you can. Just unmute and read these verses.
Yes, anyone can volunteer. Sister Ipshita, can you?
Can I?
Yeah, go ahead, please.
Okay, brother.
Can you read it loudly?
Yeah.
Genesis 26. So all the wells that his father's servant had dug in the time of his sorry, of his father Abraham, the Philistines stopped up filling the earth. Then Abimelech said to Isaac, "Move away from us. You have become too powerful for us." So Isaac moved from there and camped in the valley of where he settled. Isaac reopened the wells that had been dug in the time of his father Abraham, where the Philistine had stopped up after Abraham died, and he gave them the names his father had given them. Verse 19. Isaac's servants dug in the valley and discovered a well of fresh water there. But the herders of Gerar quarreled with those of Isaac and said, "The water is ours." So he named the well Esek, because they disputed with him. Verse 21. Then they dug another well, but they quarreled over that one also. So he named it Sitna. He moved on from there and dug another well, and no one quarreled over it. He named it Rehoboth, saying, "Now the Lord had given us room, and we will flourish in the land." From there he went up to Beersheba. That night the Lord reappeared to him and said, "I am the God of your father Abraham. Do not be afraid, for I am with you. I will bless you and will increase the number of your descendants for the sake of my servant Abraham." Verse 25. Isaac built an altar there and called on the name of the Lord. There he pitched his tent, and there his servants dug a well. Meanwhile, Abimelech had come to him from Gerar with Ahuzat, his personal advisor, and Philok, the commander of his forces. Isaac asked them, "Why have you come to me, since you were hostile to me and sent me away?" Verse 28. They answered, "We saw clearly that the Lord was with you. So we said, there ought to be a sworn agreement between us and you. Let us make a treaty with you that you will do us no harm, just as we did not harm you, but away treaty, but always treated you well and sent you away peacefully. And now you are blessed by the Lord." Isaac then made a feast for them, and they ate and drank. Verse 31. Early the next morning, the men swore an oath to each other. Then Isaac sent them on the way, and they went away peacefully. Verse 32. Day Isaac's servants came and told him about the well they had dug. They said, "We found water." He called it Sheba. To this day, the name of this town has been called Beersheba. Amen.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much for reading that. Now, as you look at this passage, actually this is verse 15. Just give me a minute. I'll just change that. Just give me a minute. Yeah, so verse 15, what is the first word in that verse? Please unmute and speak, because I cannot, this one, I'll just see if I can put on the chat. Okay. So, what does the word start with?
Yeah, anyone? What does verse 15 start with? What is the first word? Anyone? Any response?
You can type it in the chat. I can see the chat as well. So
So,
Yeah. Or unmute and speak, no problem.
so
the word "so." Okay. So the minute, those of us who have studied English grammar, the word "so," what part of speech is it?
We didn't study it that well. No, I think it's connecting to the previous.
Yeah, so this word is a conjunction, and it
Yeah.
means that there is a link with the previous word. And
Okay.
if you look at the previous verse in verse 14, just go back to that. The previous verse 14, he had so many, you can see it, right? He had so many flocks and herds and servants that the Philistines envied him. Okay? And therefore, because the Philistines envied him, because he had grown prosperous, he had a beautiful wife, and Abimelech also, in one sense, respected him and decided that he will not harm him in any way because of the fact that he was fairly rich, influential, and also probably for his father's sake. We don't know why. But clearly, there was a little bit of jealousy. People were jealous about who he is and what he had become. And so, because of that, what happened? What did the Philistines do?
Yeah. What did the Philistines do? Any response? Because of that jealousy? Anyone? Unmute and answer or put it on the chat. Yeah. What did they do? Come on, anyone? It's right there. Yeah.
You can type it in the chat. I'm not going to be, it's not going to be a monologue. I was told that this is a Bible study where all
No
of you.
negative. Yeah. They do. This is now everybody's from different places. So, come on,
Okay.
friends. Let's respond quickly and encourage the Bible study. What did they do as a
The answer is there. It's very clearly on the screen. Because they were jealous, because they were envious, what did they try and do to him?
is yeah, Dr. Brenda? Any response, Mrs. Thorat?
I'm driving. So
Oh,
yeah,
sorry. Okay,
said, I don't know, but from what I recollect, I think they filled up the wells with
right.
mud
They
or something.
filled up the wells with earth.
Okay.
And
Yeah.
do you think that was troublesome for Isaac?
Definitely. But he did not even retaliate. He just knew that God's blessing was with him, so he went off to another place.
Okay, but my point is that sometimes when we face opposition, the opposition is not necessarily for any fault of ours. It could be because people are envious of us. People are not very comfortable with us. Okay, and this was something that Isaac also faced. So why would it be so important in that context, in where they lived, for wells or a series of wells to be so important to Isaac? What was wealth measured in at that point in time?
Well,
Yeah, even when he was talked of as being a wealthy person.
blessing actually.
Yeah. The envy was, verse 14 says he had so many flocks and herds and servants that the Philistines envied him.
Yeah.
Yeah, he had cattle, he had flocks, he had herds. So he was both planting crops as well as he was involved in animal husbandry. He was rearing cattle. And as Anne mentions here, this was probably desert or close to desert, very arid land. And water is a very critical resource. And believe me, even today, water continues to be such a critical and important resource. isn't it?
Yeah.
It is said that, of all the world's water, just about less than 2% of the water, well, the bulk of the earth is covered with water. Less than 2% of the water is water that is potable, water that can be drunk. Okay, a very small portion of the total water resources on the earth can be drunk. In a country like India, for instance, we have 16% of the world's population, but we have only 4% of the world's water resources. Okay, that is why they say, the next world war, when it's fought, will also be over water rights. And even today, you find, don't we, between states in India, this whole fight over riparian rights, rights over water. So water was a big problem then as well. Even when Hagar and Ishmael were cast out into the desert, they were in danger of dying because of thirst. And water was important for cattle. Okay, it meant that the entire surrounding area for watering his fields, for entire life, it would have been a challenge or a problem. Okay, the water would be even more fundamental, Sajan, than resources like fuel, because without water, fuel is of no use. And one of the biggest problems with what we saw in the heat or the hot climate in India, in Bangalore this summer, was the danger of the city not having water, or the water resources just being able to last for maybe 2 or 3 months. And if the rains don't come, a city would have trouble. People in Bombay know that though we have been fairly forward looking, we have reservoirs, we know that without water, the city is in big danger. So this was really a problem. So water is a resource that people fought about. And so when they wanted to trouble someone, they wanted someone to move away from where he was. This is what they did. What they did is they just went and filled them up with earth and said that you can't use this water. This is our land. You can't use this water. And then the king himself, probably because of the pressure that he had from all of them, he said, move away from us. You become too powerful for us. And I think this is the point that was made. So what did he do? He moved away. Okay. So that's one of the things that he did. And then he discovered some more water. He went away from them and he went to the valley of Gerar, where he was not immediately proximate to the bulk of, to the more urbanized concentration. So he moved to a more remote place, and he dug in that valley, and he got fresh water. And then what happens?
Yeah. What happened then? In the
Again,
next.
the herdsmen of Gerar, they strive with him, saying
The
that this
herd,
water is theirs.
so the herders of Gerar quarreled with those of Isaac and said the water is ours. And so he named the well Isaac because they disputed with him over it. And the word Ezek means actually dispute. So they disputed with him. And then what did he do? And what did his servants do after that?
Another well.
He dug another well. Okay, so there, the wells that his father had already dug and put so much of effort in it, in some sense, you would say that was his inheritance, that was filled up. He went and reopened some of those wells, okay, and discovered a fresh well of fresh water. And then he had to move out from there. So there was a dispute. And then there was another well, and they quarreled over that as well. And then finally, they themselves got tired of fighting with him over wells. Or maybe he had gone so far out that he didn't bother anybody. He just went to a new place altogether. And he named it Rehoboth, it says. And he says, God has now given us room and we will flourish in this place. So, what does that tell us about his character?
Yeah, anyone? What kind of a person was he? who did not retaliate.
He likes peace.
He likes peace. Okay.
He had patience. He was consistent with God in faith.
Mhm.
Okay. Anyone else? You can put it in the chat also. Yeah, speak up. Yeah, Brother Murli, go ahead.
Yeah, I think he did not repeat what his father had done, and he was more gracious in his response to situations.
Mhm. Mhm. Where do you say his father was was his father again a little more violent?
Of course, he didn't have that same experience, but his father did the digging of the well, and which was shut down.
Okay,
But
okay. Yeah. So, but then, yeah. So his father was able to use that well, but then after his father had moved out of that place, and then later when Isaac moves there, okay, yeah. So,
Yeah, on the chat.
the father didn't have the same experience. So he was peace loving. You think he was a coward?
no, he was not a coward.
You think he ran away from a fight, ran away from disputes? You know, sometimes when we measure people's strength, when we look at leaders, we think that guys who are loud, strong, are the real leaders. People who are soft, people who.
I think.
Yeah, go ahead, please.
I think those who refrain from being raising a fight are more stronger than people who just blurt out in anger or be loud. So I think people who want to avoid, there's a lot of self-control there that happens.
You're saying that it takes much more toughness to be self-controlled. It takes much more. It needs more strength.
You decide to stay away from conflict, and then you decide that you want to not cause disharmony, but allow the situation to pass. Yeah.
So so we will come to the lessons later. But what we see about Isaac is that he was a person who genuinely loved peace, and rather than dispute and fight, and I think that can be an important lesson for us. Okay, while it was perfectly within his rights because he had dug the well, or his father had dug the well, and all that he was doing was utilizing resources which he had the prior claim to than anybody else. And yet when people come and contest it and they can be very unreasonable with him, you find him willing to give up his rights. Okay. Very clearly. Because in some sense, he had strength which came not from winning an argument, shouting at somebody else, beating up someone. It came, and not from having the last word. It came actually from a very deep sense that he could trust his father because he had seen he could trust his God because he had seen the God of his father do miraculous things for himself, for him and for the family. And so you find that when he went up to Beersheba, God appears to him and says that I am the God of your father Abraham. Don't be afraid, and I will be with you. Okay. And then what happens after that?
Yeah. Anyone? And then what happened? Some nice comments on the chat from the earlier discussion. Yeah. Yeah. And then what happened? Yeah.
The Lord
A
appears.
certain altar pitched his tent and digged another well.
Okay. And then after that, okay, it says that he pitched his tent there, and again his servants dug a well there. And then Abimelech came up to him, the king again, with his personal advisor and the commander of his forces. They come up to him. Okay. And why do you think they came up to him?
They knew the Lord was with him.
They knew the Lord was with them. Normally, what would you expect when you, when there is a king and he has his whole big retinue, and you are all said and done, you may be powerful, influential, but you're still an individual. You don't have such large resources. You don't have an army at your command. You're not powerful. So normally, what would happen when there is when you have a meeting with a king?
There will be again fight.
So, yeah, but usually when people have to meet kings, what is the normal process that is followed?
He will be summoned.
He will be summoned, right? So just imagine you have to meet the Prime Minister of this country. How do you expect that meeting to happen? Even if the Prime Minister wants to meet you, he doesn't normally come and meet you, right? He would send an invitation. In the case of a king who had rights of life and death over people, he would be summoned. And here you find, instead of Isaac being summoned, the king, his advisor, and the commander of his forces actually come to him. They come to his place rather than him having to go there. And why do you think they do that?
Yeah, anyone?
Because they knew the Lord was with him. And they decided to have an agreement. They were scared.
Yeah, that's the question that I wanted to ask. Do you think Isaac was a weak person? Do you think he was a coward? It doesn't seem so, no, when you look at this. And yet you find him, how does he respond to them? So they can come to him and they say that we are coming to you. We want to meet you because we know God is with you. And we don't want to take any chances because we have seen your God. We have seen the God your father followed. We've seen the God you follow. And we have seen how he cares for you, how he takes care of you. And we don't want to cross his paths. So again, for that, we want to make a treaty with you. Rather than it be the other way around. Here you have a king with whatever it be, his tribe or his kingdom, wanting to make a treaty with an individual, all said and done. Okay. And then how does he take care of them? What does he do? Does he hold grudges that they had sent him away? He started by saying that, why have you come to me? You were so hostile to me, you sent me away. How does he then respond to them? Verse 30.
He made a feast for them. He
made a feast for them. He ate and he drank. He was gracious. Okay. That is something that we can actually learn from. That he did not hold grudges. He was willing to throw away those grudges, relinquish those grudges, and continue to actively seek peace. And then again, there are lessons for us in a world where we today see so much of hostility, so much of hostile action, and people defending sometimes cruel acts on various reasons, often quoting religious texts and scriptures, being violent. Isaac stands out as someone quiet, dignified, peaceful, and yet strong, because at the end of the day, his strength comes from following the one true living God, the God of his father Abraham. And it is not just him having to go and run after kings. Kings actually came to him. And then it says that Isaac's servants came and told him about the well they had dug. And it says that they have found water. And he called it Sheba. And to this day, the name of that town has been Beersheba. So what do you think it tells us about Isaac? In terms of, one is, yes, he was a peace-loving person. He was strong. He was respected. Do you think he had strong faith in God? And all that came His confidence came from a very deep-rooted faith in God.
Anyone? Any response? Did he have a strong faith in God? Yeah. What does it look like? What does it feel like to you? Yes, I think there's a response there. Yes.
You find that even when confronted with the problem of childlessness, he prays to God, right? And God answers his prayer. It's all that we find that all said and done, for all the mistakes that he made, he has that quiet confidence which comes from faith in God. And that we don't have to be externally very muscular in the way we practice our faith. We don't have to be muscular in the way we live. We don't have to be aggressive. We don't have to be people who have to display strength by showing brute force and power and use our words and by loudness. We can, with quietness and quiet confidence, because it is rooted in God, we can actually reflect a lot of strength and the world will recognize it. And that's something that Isaac's life tells us. Okay. Well, they also raised children. And we find that this is where sometimes you find that Isaac probably was very traditional. He forgot the fact that, or he stuck to the traditional way in which he said that my blessing will be to the eldest. And you find probably between him and his wife, there were differences. His wife favored the younger child and Isaac favored the older child because he was the older one and felt that he had the right to the blessing. His birthright anyway was gone because Jacob had cheated Esau of it. But in any case, you find that in the matter of children, perhaps there are things we can learn not just from positives in his life, but also from the negatives. And there are lots that parents can learn by just looking at the lives of Isaac and Rebekah in terms of the way we bring up children. And yet, if you remember, God's promise was that the younger child would actually be served by the older. Rebecca was not willing to wait for that time and process and method and chose to find it in her own way. Isaac, we don't know what the way he really looked at it and the way he looked at that promise. But nonetheless, the Bible presents its heroes. Bible presents its characters exactly as they are. So by a quick reading of the life of Isaac, especially the way in which he faced and handled disputes, he handled difficulties, he handled difficult times, he handled a very hostile environment and people around him. What in the present can we learn from Isaac's life? We have covered some of them, but what is it that we can learn and what can we take to heart and practice in our own lives, which is looking at Isaac?
Yeah. Anyone? What can we learn? What comes to you personally, immediately? Anything struck you? Any impressions from the story? Anyone? Faith, trust, dependence on God. Yeah, Brother Sajjan has said here.
One thing you shared that I never looked at it that way, that when Abraham took Isaac along with him to sacrifice, his complete faith in the God of his father or in the father himself.
Both in the father and the God of his father. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. So just because people are hostile, people are aggressive, we don't have to respond that way. And sometimes, even when you look at the way we relate, even in church and in church circles, in groups, there is so much of one-upmanship, wanting to have the last word always. Isaac didn't bother about all that. He just quietly went about what he had to do, right?
Correct.
And even in quietness and confidence, we can be strong. Was Isaac successful?
Was Isaac successful? Anyone?
Extremely successful.
Did he achieve much? Yeah, even measured by worldly standards, he did things. He achieved success. He grew rich. He was successful at what he did. He planted crops. He grew the size of his herd. Yeah, he grew rich and prosperous. He was successful. And you don't have to be aggressive and competitive and wanting to go ahead to be successful, right? You can, in a quiet, confident way, reflect that. You can, without being deceitful, cheating others, continue to gain success, isn't it? Patiently relying on God's way, right? Relying on God's time. You don't have to win every dispute. Sometimes walk away from dispute. Actively seek peace. There are so many lessons that Isaac's life has to give us. And I think particularly in a time like this, in a time when we face a certain degree of hostility,
Yes.
the environment in which we are,
Mm.
maybe Isaac's life has a lot to tell us and teach us. And we can flash the light of God's word on our own lives and look at ourselves. How do we conduct ourselves in our conversations, over social media, in our messaging, in the way we relate with family, with friends? Ask that question. Is there something I can learn from Isaac? Does my character, does my conduct, do my actions reflect that confidence in God?
Mm.
Or are we no different from the world that we see around us? The muscular forms of how religion is practiced around us. And I think that's a very important lesson for the church. If we have to make an impact in our world and in our country at this particular point in time, I think it is this character and ability to respond as Christ responded. And that is actually what Isaac really did, as actively seeking out peace. I think has a lot to tell us. So continue to think about it. Continue to put down. I deliberately didn't put my thoughts down because I wanted each of us to discover this by just studying it. So go back, study the passages, read through the disputes in a little more detail,
Yeah.
and figure out how he dealt with each of them, and ask God to speak to us. And I do hope and pray that ultimately Isaac's life will be a great lesson for the way we are and the way we live. And that in kindness, in gentleness, in meekness, our strength will be. Meekness doesn't mean that we let others just walk over us. No, it doesn't mean that. Meekness simply means recognizing the fact that God is above all, and that at the end of the day, I don't have to be aggressive and violent and competitive and ruthless to reach the place I aspire to reach. But more importantly, the place where I believe God would take me to and lead me to. And I think that God in that equation, God as the center of our lives, becomes very important. So Isaac was very confident that God was there in his life. And the Lord reassures him that he was always with him. And so between a very imposing father and a very colorful son, Isaac's life also stands in a very quiet way, showing the path for us as to how we can live.
Yeah. Can we unshare the screen now?
Okay.
Yeah. Any thoughts, friends? Anything that struck you? Any reflection on this passage? Any further thought expanding upon what we learned, or any counter to this is also welcome. Yeah.
Yeah, sorry. Brother, thank you for sharing the lessons from Isaac. I'm just wondering, in terms of handling disputes, the New Testament has some clear guidelines. Like, for example, 1 Corinthians 11 and Matthew chapter 19. It does, although we forgive the person who's harmed us, but there needs to be a legal action, both in the terms of the civil court as well as in the church governing body. So I'm not sure. Can we take a passive position in terms of handling dispute? I mean, in Isaac's case, it seems to be quite a passive approach to things. They said leave the place. So there was a dispute about the well, so he left. So when it comes to disputes among brothers and family members, can we take that approach today, or because there is a legal course of action mentioned in the New Testament itself?
What is the legal course of action that the New Testament talks about?
Matthew 19. So go and talk to the brother. If the brother doesn't listen to you, I think it's 19. I'm not sure exact verse. Church discipline. So go and talk to the brother. The brother doesn't listen to you, take it to the elders. If he doesn't listen to the elders, then leave it alone. And 1 Corinthians 11, he talks about the church being the civil court. You bring it to the church.
Yeah.
But in the case of Isaac, there's no church, there's no a civil governing body that has a jurisdiction there. So I'm not sure if you can apply that. Sorry.
Yeah, so that is true. But what do you think is the better option?
Yeah, I'm just wondering. I'm just questioning. Is it like, can we take the case of Isaac and say let's walk away without any sort of?
So let's take dispute over possessions, right? So the point is that there could be dispute over possessions within the family. Was one of the points that you talked about, and of course there is legal recourse for disputes over possessions. Now, what do we think is, or what could a Christian think is the best position? To continue with a dispute, or to let the other person have it? Because is it always passive? Yeah. Does it mean that you're covered? Does it mean that you're scared? Who actually, if you go back to recognizing ownership, no? Who do our possessions belong to in the world?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Ultimately, whose is the world?
God's.
Isn't it?
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
So if one were to take that position, the need to fight over every square inch of land, the need to fight over every rupee in the bank account. Sometimes you find siblings fighting over all these things. That's because we've never really recognized what true ownership is. Whose does the land belong to? Who do the possessions belong to? Are they mine to fight over? Yes, there are legal processes.